Hello and welcome to our lesson today. My name is Noelle. Everyone else want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name's Lisa.
My name is Alina.
And my name's Samantha.
I'm Jenna.
Great. So we are a part of InterAxon, an organization at the University of Southern California. Our goal is to educate local schools in STEM topics and especially neuroscience. Our hope is to inspire more students to consider science and medicine as a future career. What you're going to see today is one of our first virtual lessons, which was prepared with the idea in mind of a teacher being able to share it in class anytime. We really hope you enjoy it. So let's get to the content. So our topic for today, what is memory? So memory is a pretty big topic. It is pretty hot among psychologists and neuroscientists, and we think you're gonna find it pretty interesting. There's a lot of different analogies that people like to use to talk about memory. Because it's such a huge topic, it's really hard to define. Some people like to compare it to a library, where it's just this vast collection of knowledge in one place. So we have to ask, when we store memory, is it there forever? And also, do we keep memory in one place? People also like to compare memory to a video recorder, where we're just constantly collecting every little detail. But I think we all know we don't remember every little detail, so how does this analogy work? People also like to compare memory to a spider web, where all of our memories are collected to each other, and we're constantly building up this web. But we also have to ask, how do we connect these memories to each other, and is it always completely accurate? The short answer to these questions is yes and no, and the long answer is the rest of this presentation. So now we're going to go ahead and hand it off to Lisa, who's going to tell us a little bit about different types of memory.
So there are many different types of memory, and these can be blocked off into two sections. So the short-term memory is when you first see something or hear something, and you remember for 10 to 15 seconds immediately after it happens. After, your brain can determine that it's not as important to store, or it can determine that it is important to store, and it becomes a long-term memory. And there are also two different types of long-term memories. So first of all, we have explicit memories, which are conscious memories and things like facts or events, and you can remember things like your name or your birthday last year, and those types of things. But then there are also implicit memories, which are things like associations. So for example, you associate a library with a book, or they're procedural, which is basically you can remember how to ride a bicycle. So there are three different processes to how memory works. So first of all, when you hear or learn something, it's encoded into your brain through a process that is pretty complicated. And then it is stored in your brain in some of the previous processes that we talked about earlier. So it can be a short-term or long-term memory in your brain. And then it goes into the process of retrieval. And retrieval is super, super amazing. And we can remember a lot about what we've learned, but it's also not perfect. So everyone try to think of a funny memory that's happened to you. And it can be either from a day ago or a year ago, just try to think of something. And as you're thinking about it right now, it's probably not as funny as it was in the moment. And why is that? It's because retrieval is amazing, but it's not perfect. So the lived memory is much more powerful than the retrieval process. Also, something happens called the Ebbinghaus curve, and that's when at first when you have a memory, you forget it at a super, super fast rate, since there are a lot of little details that you don't necessarily need to remember in the long term. However, as time goes on, you start forgetting at a slower rate because only the most important parts of the memory are left, and so those stay with you for a very long time.
So many of you may know that memory is associated with the brain, but there are many specific areas that are designated to certain aspects of memory. The word neuroanatomy breaks down into three parts. Neuro, which is having to do with the nervous system, ana, which is meaning up, and tomio, which is cutting. Therefore, anatomy refers to cutting up, and neuroanatomy means that we're cutting up parts of the brain to see its different parts, like we can see in this picture. In the majority of the population, our memory functions more as a holistic summary of our experiences, rather than a detailed record of everything we've been through like a video camera would do. There are four major parts of the brain that function in memory, and these take up a large portion of the brain structure. A lot of what our brain controls has to do with the memory, whether it's facts, skills, movements, or ideas, so we can understand why it takes up so much of the brain. So these four parts are the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the working memory, the amygdala, which is responsible for fear and other emotions, the hippocampus, which plays an important part in learning, and the cerebellum, which is responsible for voluntary movements that we have to learn. So the first part is the prefrontal cortex, and this is the part of the brain right behind your eyes and your forehead. This area is generally associated with decision making, and it's the last part of your brain to develop. This area is only present in humans and other primates like monkeys and apes, and it's involved in many advanced functions like abstract thinking, personality, decision making, language development, and these characteristics aren't in other animals like dogs or cats. This area controls working memory, which is when you temporarily store information so you can interpret it. This is like remembering someone's address or phone number, a shopping list, or a long story when someone's explaining it to you. So when people learn and memorize information, it first has to be in your working memory in the prefrontal cortex, and then it transfers to other areas over time where it will be stored long-term. This process, like Lisa mentioned earlier, is called encoding, and it's like storing information in the computer. The prefrontal cortex also functions to remember stored memories through retrieval when it takes long-term memories from the hippocampus and accesses it when you need to. So if the prefrontal cortex is damaged, many of its functions won't work properly anymore. For example, someone might have behavioral issues, struggle with decision-making, and perform poorly on tasks that require those long-term memories or strategies.
Okay, so the next part of the brain that we're going to be talking about today is the amygdala. So where is the amygdala? Well, it is in the middle part of the brain, pretty deep in there, and it's in the temporal lobe, so pretty much on the bottom part of the brain. In this diagram, it is the yellow object, and you can see that it's pretty deep in there and pretty much on the bottom. So what does it do? Well, its main job is to regulate strong emotions such as fear and aggression. And fearful memories actually tend to be more vivid. Why is fear more important for memory? Well, fear has a really big impact on our memory because it's such a strong emotion. For example, if you've ever seen a scary movie, maybe you remembered the part of the movie that made you really scared. And this is because the really emotional response was attached to your memory. The amygdala also has to do with the fight or flight response. So what is this? Well, when you're presented with something that may harm you or maybe a threat to you, you can either flee from it or you can fight it. So the amygdala pretty much controls that response. It is also really important for memory consolidation, which basically means when your memories go into your brain and stay there. And experiments actually show that stimulation of the amygdala is really important for a stronger memory. In one experiment, for example, by Willie, Inman, and Mans, the researchers showed participants objects and only stimulated their brains with electrical stimulation on some of the objects. When the participants came back a couple days later, they better remembered the objects on which their amygdala was stimulated. So next, I'm going to be talking about the hippocampus. So the hippocampus has a primary function of memory. And in Greek, hippos equals horse, and campos means sea monster. And as you can see in the picture to the left, that is a hippocampus compared to a seahorse. So hippocampus pretty much means seahorse. And I think it was named pretty well because it really looks like one. So still is much unknown about this area and memory in general because memory can be pretty difficult to test because we don't know exactly what's going on in people's brains. However, we do know that the hippocampus is responsible for storing long-term memories, and it makes them resistant to forgetting. So some of these memories that the hippocampus deals with are, procedural memories such as learning how to ride a bike. So you would know how to do that for a long time. The hippocampus is also important for spatial navigation. So to better illustrate what this means, try to walk yourself through your school in your mind. You're walking down a hallway, walking past classrooms. Well, that's spatial navigation. It basically has to do with how you navigate through space. And there's a really interesting phenomena called mind palaces, which is basically rooms in your brain that you create and different maps that you create in your brain to better navigate through thoughts and places in time.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is located in the back of your brain near your brainstem. It's also known as the little brain in Latin, and it actually contains about 50% of the neurons in the brain, despite it only taking up 10% of your brain. It also receives information from the sensory systems, the spinal cord, and other parts of your brain. And it's also considered the old part of the brain. So it has existed before humans have actually existed. The cerebellum also coordinates voluntary movements such as your posture, so how well you're sitting up, your balance to make sure that you're able to walk in a straight line, coordination, and your speech as well. It's also responsible for helping, like I said, to coordinate your movement and fine-tune your reflexes. And it's also responsible for your short-term memory, motor learning, and your procedural memory as well. So the question here is, can we actually trust our memory? So your memories are kind of like a good comparison to that is to a spider web. So over time, you're going to make more and more connections and more memories throughout your entire life, basically. But this isn't perfect because there's a phenomena called flashbulb memories, which are highly detailed, quote unquote, snapshots of events that happened over time, which could actually be false. So additionally, your memory deteriorates over time because you're more likely to remember something better when it happened more recently. So for example, you might be able to remember what you had for breakfast this morning, but you might not be able to remember what you had for breakfast 5 years ago today. So one really interesting example of a false flashbulb memory that was noted in history was that George Bush had claimed that he had seen the first airplane crash into the World Trade Center on 9/11. But even though he was actually located in Florida at an elementary school that day, so it was physically impossible for him to have actually seen it or to remember it.
Thank you, Jana. That's pretty much it for our presentation today. We're going to go ahead and move on to an optional memory activity. So we're going to show you a list of 18 words that you have 1 minute to memorize. Really try to think back to a lot of the techniques that we've talked about in all the different parts of the brain. Do you guys think you can do it? Go ahead and pause now if you want to get out a piece of paper and a pen, and unpause when you think you're ready to go. Are you ready? I'll go ahead and start the timer and we'll start. Go. All right, time is up. So take a moment now, pause the video, and try to write down all the words that you can remember. And once you've done that, unpause the video. All right, how did you do? Take all the words that you got correct, divide by 18, and multiply by 100. And that's how you know what percentage you got correct. Go ahead and discuss with others the words that you got right. Do you notice a pattern between any of the words you got correct? Did some of them have a personal significance to you? Maybe that's why you remember them more easily. And now really challenge yourself to think about all the different parts of your brain that are working to help you remember those words. And especially think if you use a strategy, what parts of the brain are you engaging? If you used a mind palace, do you think you were using your hippocampus? So that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Keep on the lookout for more lessons like this that we'll be posting, and please stay safe. Thanks again.